So if you look up at the top of our screen, we have this option that says Blender Render. If we click on this, by default we have three options: Blender Render, Blender Game, and Cycles Render. And Blender Game, of course, just puts the entire Blender program into Blender Game creation mode. So that's not really so much of a render engine as it is just a different mode to use Blender in. But the two main render engines for Blender are Blender's default render engine, Blender Render, and Blender's secondary render engine, Cycles, which is what we use to create much more realistic looking materials and environments. Cycles Render has definitely become the go-to render engine for Blender due to its awesomeness and ability to make things look real. But there are also advantages to the Blender render engine that should not be overlooked. For this reason, we're going to spend a couple of videos going over some basics about Blender render materials, UV maps, textures, and stuff like that. One big advantage the Blender render engine has over the Cycles render engine is that the Blender render engine has been around longer, and thus there's a lot more visual feedback built into Blender to help display Blender render materials. Things like specular maps, bump maps, and stuff like that will show up in the live 3D view when using Blender render, but not so much when using Cycles. The other really good reason to have a basic foundation of using Blender render materials is that Blender render materials are the type of materials that will be used when importing objects used for game assets or exporting objects to be used for games. So things like bump maps, specular maps, and things like that, you're going to have to know how to handle those in Blender render if you plan on making assets for games or editing assets that other people have created for games. So it's good to have a basic understanding of some Blender render stuff, and it can actually help make you a better Cycles render user just by knowing some foundational stuff about the Blender render engine. So let's click on the Material tab here using the Blender render engine. So when we click on the Material tab, we'll see some things here. So we see this little box here, and this will display all of the materials on whatever object you have selected. Right now we have no materials, so this box is empty. We can move this up and down by clicking this thing. If we click this button here, this will display all of the materials that happen to be in the file, and not just the materials that belong to this specific object. And directly to the right of that, we have the New button, which will create a new material for our object. So if we press New, we now have one material inside of our box here, which displays all the materials belonging to this object. And if we look in this button here, we'll see a list of all the materials in the entire file, which happens to be just this one material. To the far right over here, we have this plus and minus sign. And what these do is add or remove material slots. So Blender has this kind of convoluted system of your objects don't just have materials, but they have material slots. And material slots are basically like housing units for the material. So you can have like several material slots on an object and not actually have any materials in them. So for instance, if I were to press plus right now, we'll see this new little blank symbol, which represents that this is a material slot. Basically, it's an open home saying, hey, a material can come live here where I am, but currently I'm an empty material slot because I don't have any actual materials housed in me. And we can press this minus button to remove the active material slot, which incidentally will also remove the material it's on if there happens to be a material in that material slot. So if I press minus with this one highlighted here, it'll just erase that material slot. But if I were to press minus again, it will erase that first material slot and the material that was on it called material. Under here, this little kind of black pressed in little symbol here, if we click on this, this actually gives us copying and pasting options. So this is a way to get materials from one object to another object. Of course, we have a much faster way to do that in our ZeroBrush options menu. So if you press Q to bring up your options menu, if you have the full version of ZeroBrush, you'll see a bit more options in here than if you're using ZeroBrush Lite. But in either version, you'll see this option that says Material Options, and we can do the things listed here and more in this menu here. Okay, so let's press New again. And notice that this time when I pressed New, that the material is called Material 0.001. And that is because typically when you delete things in Blender, they won't be really dead and gone until you delete it and then save your file and then open up your file again. This can be pretty annoying sometimes, but it's kind of a nice safeguard of the software itself. It helps prevent crashing, and it helps prevent different add-ons perform more advanced functions and stuff like that. If we click on this little button, which I said displays all the materials within the file, you'll see the first material we actually created has this little 0 by it. And what that little 0 means is that this first material we created has no users. Basically, there's no objects anywhere in the scene that are using that material. So anything you see with a 0 by it, whether it's a material or an object or a flim-flammy Magoo or what have you, this means that when you save the file, so right now if we were to press File and Save As, and I'll just save this to my desktop as my file here, press Save as Blender file. This means that when I open this back up, this material will be actually removed because it has no users. So if I were to go ahead and press File and Quit, and then open up myfile.blend, and then if I click back on the Material tab, and then we click here to see the file's total amount of materials, notice that that material is gone because there were no objects using it. Which gets us to this next little button, F here, which stands for Fake User. And basically what that means is, hey, I don't care if the material is being used by an object or not. I want it available in my scene, whether or not it belongs to a cube or a Suzanne head or a character or a table or whatever. So if we were to press F on this material, notice this number switches to 2, and this is actually letting us know how many total users there are of this material. And so technically there are 2 users because we have this cube that's using it, and then we've also told Blender to give it a fake user hidden sort of in the background so that if we ever delete this, it will still be in the file's overall materials. So I could either press X to delete this material, or I could press this minus sign, which would delete the material slot and material at the same time. So if I press X to delete the material, notice that material slot is still there. It looks like every other material slot we add, but then I could press this minus to remove it. So when we deleted the first material, if we click on this button to see the scene's total materials, it had a 0 by its name, which means it had no users, nothing was using it, and if we were to save the file and reload it, it would be gone the next time. But because we told Blender, hey, pretend like this material does have a user, even if there is none, it will stay around in the file if we want it to. So if I were to go ahead and press File and Save here, and then Quit, and then open this back up, and click on the Material tab, whereas the first time that material was gone, this time it's still around. So I could actually click on it to give this object that material back. And we can rename these materials we create either up here in this box here or directly under here. So we could just click on here and change its name to My First Material. Why not? Okay, we'll click that. So here's our material here. So this button to the far right over here, this controls whether or not this material uses nodes. All materials that we create while in Cycles Render will be using nodes, but you can also use nodes on materials created in Blender Render as well, and we'll get into what all that means here in a little bit. And to the far right, we have this little box that says data, and what this lets you do is decide, should this material be linked to the object itself, or should it be linked to the object's data? This particular object's data, because it's a mesh object, what that means is its actual mesh. So the object itself is called cube here, but the object's data is the mesh inside of it. That's basically the stuff that we're, editing and things like that when we are in edit mode. So for instance, I could double right click over here, add a monkey. This monkey head is called Suzanne, as we can see highlighted down here in the outliner. But if I click its little plus sign, its data, its mesh, is actually this mesh called Suzanne here. And we can actually switch out data blocks for different objects. Press tab to go back into object mode and click on this cube. And click on the data tab, which will change icons depending on what type of object it happens to be, whether it's a lamp, a camera, or a mesh object or something. And here is the data, the mesh of this particular object is cube, but I could actually switch its data out to that Suzanne mesh if I wanted, like this. And this still says cube. This is still technically this cube object. It's just using the Suzanne mesh data. So over here, back on the material slot, notice that the material that was belonging to this object is nowhere to be found because we actually had the material linked to the Suzanne mesh and not the cube object itself. So if I were to come here and switch this mesh back to cube and then click on the material tab, notice now that the material is back. So this lets us say, hey, we want the user of this, which we talked about what the user is, basically who is using the material, which object is using the material, to be the data. We want the link to the association to be with the mesh, the inner stuff inside of the object that creates the object, and not the object itself. But you could switch this to object, and then its user would be considered the actual cube there, regardless of what mesh it was using its data. And if you're a new user, I'm sure a lot of this stuff sounds super complicated, but fuck it, you're gonna learn this stuff now and not slowly, painfully learn about this stuff over the course of years, being confused and disoriented with this stuff, or just being tripped up by the tiniest thing because you didn't know about this stuff. So you're learning it now, you're getting it out of the way. And if you don't remember something or you need to come back and make a quick reference, just come back to this video and watch, and then you'll understand about how all these buttons work, what they do, and what their purpose is.